after spending more than 45 years on death row, Bryan Frederick Jennings was executed by lethal injection in Florida. When the warden asked if he had any final words, he said, "No, that was it. 45 years, and he still wouldn't apologize for what he did." But to understand why he was strapped to that gurney, we need to go back to the night of May 10th, 1979. A 6-year-old girl named Becky Kunash had just finished rehearsing her lines. In a few hours, she was supposed to star in her first grade school play. Her costume was laid out. She fell asleep, excited. But she never made it to the morning, because while Becky slept, someone was standing outside her window, watching. Bryan Frederick Jennings, just 20 years old and stationed with the U.S. Marines in Okinawa, Japan, had returned to Merritt Island for a short visit with his mother. That night, after drinking at a local bar with a friend, Bryan slipped away alone. He had a habit of roaming neighborhoods after dark, lurking near windows and watching from the shadows. It wasn't something he ever told his friends about, but this time his habit took a darker turn. As he walked, he noticed a faint glow coming from a nearby house. It was a nightlight, soft and dim, shining through a little girl's window. Bryan stopped and watched, and for reasons even he couldn't name, he didn't walk on. Something made him stay. Moments later, he moved closer. He took out the screen, slid the window open, and slipped inside. Becky barely stirred before a hand covered her mouth. Bryan lifted her from the bed, carried her out through the yard, and laid her in his car. From there, he drove toward the Girard Street Canal on Merritt Island, a quiet, isolated spot where no one would hear a sound. What happened next was brutal. Bryan her, using such force that both he and Becky got visible injuries down under, but it didn't end there. In a burst of rage, he lifted Becky by the legs and slammed her onto the ground so hard that the impact fractured her skull. She was still alive when he dragged her to the canal's edge. There, he forced her head underwater and held it down, waiting until she stopped moving. Then he let her go, leaving her in the water for the alligators to find. It was over in minutes. Becky, who had fallen asleep with the lines of her school play still in mind, never made it to the morning. Only a few hours later, a fisherman noticed something floating in the canal. It was Becky. Her small body had drifted to the surface, silent and still in the murky water. Within minutes, deputies flooded the area, and within hours, investigators began piecing together the horror of what had happened that night and the name that would soon emerge behind it. That same day, Bryan was pulled over in Orange County for a minor traffic violation. He didn't resist. He answered questions, stayed calm, and even agreed to come to the police station. There, he seemed calm and cooperative. Nothing about him hinted at the horror that had unfolded hours earlier. But as detectives shared information across departments, the evidence began pointing directly to him. Moreover, the fingerprints they took at the station appeared to be exact matches to the ones found at Becky's bedroom window. At that moment, they knew he was the one they were looking for. In the early morning hours of May 12th, deputies woke him in his jail cell and brought him to an interrogation room. They read him his rights, and Bryan immediately asked for a lawyer. His voice cracked when he said it. "I have to have a lawyer for this. This is too heavy for me to do." But later he changed his mind, so detectives started the interrogation without one. At first, Bryan denied everything. He claimed he didn't even know who Becky was. But when the detectives pressed him with the evidence, his fingerprints, and his timeline, his answers began to falter. His story cracked, and then so did he. In a flat, emotionless tone, Bryan confessed. He told them he had taken Becky, assaulted her, and drowned her in the canal, and his statement opened the door to even more evidence. His clothes had her DNA on them, and he made drawings and hand-sketched maps with things only the one responsible would know. These sketches were later used in court as well. After his arrest, Bryan was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery. And from the beginning, prosecutors made it clear they were going to seek the death penalty. In June 1979, a judge ruled that Bryan's taped confession could be used in court, finding that even though there was no lawyer present when he confessed, he had spoken voluntarily and not under pressure. His trial began the following year in Brevard County. The courtroom stayed silent as the jury listened to the tape of Bryan's confession. They heard his voice, calm and cold, walking through what he did. A former cellmate testified that Bryan had bragged about the killing behind bars. 2 fingerprint analysts confirmed that his prints were found on Becky's window, proving that he was the one who broke in and took her. And when the defense tried to argue that Bryan was mentally ill, a psychiatrist shut it down. He told the jury Bryan wasn't insane. He wasn't confused. He was a predator, fully aware of what was right and wrong, but simply didn't care. Bryan's attorneys pointed to a childhood full of instability. He never knew who his real father was, and even his mother, Margaret Dana, once admitted she wasn't sure either. From the beginning, Bryan's life lacked structure. He was born prematurely and showed signs of behavioral problems before he could even form full sentences. Doctors noticed something was off early on, but no one offered real help. For the first 5 or 6 years of his life, Bryan lived with his grandparents instead of his mom. And when he did live with her, it was never steady. She bounced between jobs, and men drifted in and out of their lives without sticking around. Bryan was often left behind and forced to move and switch schools every few years because of her work. By the time he was 12, he had already begun sneaking out of the house and taking his mother's car on joyrides until morning. But despite the chaos, Bryan wasn't unintelligent. A doctor even noted that his IQ was above average. He made it to 10th grade, but then dropped out. At one point, a physician recommended he be institutionalized in Boston for long-term psychiatric care. But when Bryan told his mother he wanted to join the military instead, she backed out. She was afraid that a hospital stay would destroy his chances of ever finding government work. So he joined the military, and that decision didn't help. It only made things worse. At the time of the crime, Bryan was on leave from the U.S. Marine Corps and staying with his family on Merritt Island. But his military background didn't hide his troubled past. As a teenager, he had been arrested multiple times for burglary and trespassing, and he openly admitted to a long-standing problem with voyeurism. On February 7, 1980, the jury found Bryan guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, and sexual battery, and 4 days later, they voted 11-1 to recommend the death penalty. The judge agreed, and on May 7, 1980, sentenced Bryan to death, along with 4 life terms for the other charges. But that wasn't the end of it. The legal battle stretched on for decades. The Florida Supreme Court overturned his conviction not once but twice, which led to retrials in 1982 and again in 1986. Each time, jurors heard the same horrifying story about how Becky's life was taken. And each time, they came back with the same answer: guilty and death. And every new hearing reopened old wounds for Becky's family, forcing them to relive the loss of their youngest daughter again and again. On April 25, 1986, Bryan was sentenced to death for the 3rd and final time. But the legal battle didn't stop. For the next 40 years, he filed appeal after appeal, arguing his trial had been unfair or that his mental illness had not been properly considered. But in the end, each attempt failed. The courts upheld his sentence, ruling that the evidence and his confession left no doubt about his guilt. The sentence stood. Then, on October 10, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis finally signed his death warrant, scheduling Bryan's execution for November 13th. His attorneys made one last attempt to stop it, but the courts wouldn't budge. Becky would have been 53 years old by then. Instead, she never made it past 6. On the morning of his execution, Bryan woke before sunrise, around 4 a.m. He ate his final meal later that day, a cheeseburger, fries, and a soda. No one came to see him that day. According to prison officials, he spent his final hours alone. Just before 6 p.m., he was led to the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, Bryan responded with a firm no. He didn't offer an apology, not to the victim's family or to anyone else in the room. As the drugs began to flow, his chest lifted sharply and his arms twitched against the gurney. For a few minutes, the movement continued, but then it stopped. His body fell still, with his mouth hanging open. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 p.m. Bryan Frederick Jennings was 66 years old. What do you think? Has justice been served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.